Hi, I'm Darcy Bits, and with the entire set of Wilds of Eldraine released, it's time to take a look at the Pauper Commanders that we can use. Pauper Commander is played like regular Commander, except your deck has to be full of only commons, and your Commander can be any uncommon creature, not just legendaries, which means we get to take a look at the set from a different perspective than others might be able to. These cards aren't going to just be a card in your deck somewhere, they get to be your commander, so we can really build around them. First, we have Tanglespan Lookout, a 3-mana 2/3 green satyr. Whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. This card is nothing super special, like it's just card draw, but it's reliable and consistent, and I think it's going to be oppressive. It also encourages you to a certain playstyle. It tells you to be using lots of auras, and that's just fun to have an excuse to do. It seems like it'll be a really fun time. I think it's going to be great, but it's first on the list because it's not a lot to say. It's just card draw. Twisted Sewer Witch is a 5-mana 3/4 black human warlock. When Twisted Sewer Witch enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black rat creature token with this creature can't block. Then for each rat you control, create a Wicked Roll token attached to that rat. The Wicked Roll token is a token aura that gives +1/+1, and when this aura is put into the graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life, which effectively means when the rat dies. This is the kind of commander that isn't something that comes down early and provides ongoing value and synergy for the entire rest of the deck. It's really more of a finisher. It encourages you to be playing this rat strategy so that when you do play Twisted Sewer Witch, you're going to be able to buff your entire board and go in for the kill. And it's kind of a pseudo trample effect in a weird way, in that if something gets blocked and dies, it's going to be pinging all of your opponents, which has a lot of value. I think it could be really strong. Even if you don't win the game off of it, that token is going to stay around forever. It's like getting a +1/+1 counter in your entire board, which I think has a lot of value. In Pauper Commander, it's really important to take a look to see if an obvious build around has enough pieces in the format, and there are certainly enough black common rats to go around to give you a lot of options. Sometimes there's enough cards, but then you have to run everything, and you don't really get a lot of deck building choice, and that it's just less fun. Dream Spoilers is kind of on here as a meme. It is a 4-mana 2/2 fairy warlock with flying. Whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, up to 1 target creature an opponent controls gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So this is identical to Dream Spoiler Witches from Lorwyn, but what's interesting is that whereas the Lorwyn version was common, this is uncommon, meaning it can be viable as a commander. But not only that, it's a functional reprint, not an actual reprint. So you can actually run both of these in the same deck. One is your commander, one in the 99, and I just think that's funny. That's kind of it. As much as I think this could be a very oppressive deck where you're able to just kill anything your opponents put on the field, eventually they're going to drop some 8/8 that you just can't deal with. So, I don't know. Maybe it's not going to be as good as we want it to be, but throw in a few just universal removal spells, and it's going to let you really hold the board down. Unfortunately, you're not really accruing much value in the process, so hopefully you have some way of building a board with those instant speed spells that you're playing on your opponent's turn, instead of just killing their stuff. Eventually, they're going to run out of stuff anyway. Knave of Stockbite Nightmares is a 4-mana 2/2 with Menace. When it enters the battlefield, you get to return a creature or enchantment from your graveyard to your hand, and then also, whenever an enchantment you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Neva, then scry 1. There's also Knight of Doves, which is mono white instead of white-black, and it's a very similar effect, but it goes wide with bird tokens. Big difference, of course, is that it has that ETB, it has Menace, it is growing itself, and it's scrying. It's a lot of stuff that's going on. They're giving you different strategies, but probably pound for pound, Neva's doing more work than Knight of Doves is. Then again, they are 1 more mana. What's interesting about these 2 cards is that they care about enchantments hitting the graveyard. And it's not just auras, which is kind of interesting. It lets you play enchantments that sacrifice themselves and stuff like that. But most of the time, you're probably going to be playing auras. Generally, you want your auras to stick around, so this encourages you towards a playstyle that plays auras on your opponent's stuff that kills them. And if you fill your entire deck with just auras that kill the thing that they're put on, your entire deck is sorcery speed removal, which, while not the greatest, is going to be very oppressive if that's your whole deck. What I like about it is it's not just shutting down your opponent's board, it's also growing yours in the process, either with counters on your commander or by going wide. When I looked at Knight of Doves, I first thought of Braincomber and Shiona, where both of these add an extra color, which gives you more versatility, but also do kind of the same thing, but instead, it's when the enchantment hits the field. Braincomber has the restriction that it has to be an aura on Braincomber, and Shiona has the restriction that it has to be an aura on a creature you control, which again lends us towards this different strategy of having Knight of Doves put enchantments on your opponents. I do honestly worry that that's not going to work with Knight of Doves because it's mono white. Neva, on the other hand, I think is going to have a great time because black enchantments, black auras really do this sacrifice thing a lot more, or minus toughness effects a lot more than white do. Next, we have Troyan Gutsy Explorer, a 3-mana green and blue 1/3 legendary creature Vedalken Scout. It can tap to add blue and green. You can spend this mana only on mana value 5 or higher spells, or on spells with X in their mana cost. You can also spend blue and tap it just to draw a card and discard a card. There is this sub-theme of high mana value green and blue. Galvanic Giant has this payoff of whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, you get to tap down a creature your opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. Tempest Heart, on the other hand, grows itself. And these two I looked at first, and they're not quite there, I don't think. Galvanic Giant has this downside of, well, you're probably only going to be doing either of these effects once per turn. If you're in green, like Tempest Heart and Troyan, then you might be able to get up to 10 mana and do it twice in a turn, but generally speaking, I think most of the time, you're doing it once per turn. Tapping down one of your opponent's creatures, even with a stun counter, when you have 3 opponents, that's not much if you're doing it only once per round. Tempest Heart, on the other hand, is growing itself, and I think 1 counter per round is a perfectly reasonable rate of growth, especially as a trampler that can really close at a game, either through commander damage or just regular. So I think Tempest Heart has a lot of potential. Troyan is my pick, though, for this sort of archetype, because it basically treats the mana value spell that you're casting as the payoff. It says you have a mana dork in your command zone that you can rely on, so you know that even though you stuff your deck full of really expensive spells, you're going to be able to consistently cast them as early as turn 4. And that's, of course, not to mention if you have any other dorks or mana rocks in your deck. At first, I wasn't really sure why the spend a blue and tap to draw a card and discard a card effect was there. It's always nice. That's just a good effect to have, but I didn't really know why. It didn't really seem to go together with the other ability. I think it's here just to give you something to do with them if you don't have that spell in hand. I've definitely played a lot of blue situational mana dorks that sit on the field and do nothing for like 2 or 3 turns because you don't have a spell that they're allowed to spend their mana on. So having this alternate mode is really, really helpful. So Galvanic Giant, I don't think works. Tempest Heart, I think has some potential, but Troyan is going to actually be able to seal that deal. It's worth pointing out that Galvanic Giant has an adventure, but it's so expensive and does so little, I don't think it's worth doing, especially since you can't play it and then go into Galvanic Giant really reliably because you want to be playing your Giant on 4 if you can. Tempest Heart actually works pretty okay because you're going to be able to cast Scan the Clouds on 2, and it actually does the same thing that Troyan does, where it's going to be drawing you into your big spells, ideally, on the curve where you care about playing them after Tempest Heart has actually come in from the adventure. Johann, Apprentice Sorcerer is a 4-mana blue and red 2/5 human wizard. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. Once each turn, you may cast an instant or sorcery spell from the top of your library. This card really just kind of amounts to card draw with extra steps, especially with that once per turn restriction on there. I think it seems actually pretty good and pretty strong, but it does have some confliction within it. On the one hand, it doesn't want you to go Spell Slinger because it's only once per turn. You can't just keep playing spells off the top of your deck. On the other hand, it does trigger every turn, so if you can play something on your turn and each of your 3 opponents' turns, that's going to be pretty strong, so I don't really know exactly what it wants to be doing. Either way, it's just not that interesting to me personally, because it's going to draw you a card, and that's kind of it. If you compare it to like Tanglespan Lookout that we saw earlier, at least that one gives you a direction to go. It encourages you to play auras, which is sort of an interesting thing to build around. Johann just says instants and sorceries. Like, whatever, just play a deck full of instant sorceries. It's just not that interesting to me personally. I'm sure it's actually going to be a really interesting commander for somebody. That person's just not me. Obyra Dreaming Duelist is a 2-mana blue and black 2/2 fairy warrior with flash, flying, and whenever another fairy enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. It seems like a really solid fairy commander. It's going to be able to give you some incidental ping just as you play your fairies. It gives you a reason to be playing a whole bunch of fairies, which is fun because it's just fun to play a fairy deck, and it's probably just going to do a great job at being the centerpiece of that fairy deck. That said, I think it's worth comparing it to Corpse Knight. Corpse Knight is white-black, so if you're set on blue-black, then it's not really a comparison. But if you're interested in going into white-black, this is basically the same. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with the same ability, except for Corpse Knight says whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life, period. Like, any creature. I like having a theme to build around. I like saying, ooh, this is a fairy deck. This is a reason to play fairies. But it's worth pointing out that Corpse Knight just does the same thing, but for any creature. Now, if your whole deck is fairies, it's the same thing. Obviously, Obyra has flash and flying, which could have some value. Flashing it in on the end of someone else's turns so that there's less time for interaction before it gets to do its thing is nice. But otherwise, having flying is probably negligible. You're not intending to attack or block with this, really. You want it just on the field doing its incidental value thing. You might be able to get in a few times while no one has any flyers, so that's something. And finally, Greta Sweettooth Scourge is a 3-mana black and green 3/3 human warrior with when Greta Sweettooth Scourge enters the battlefield, create a food token. Green, sacrifice a food, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, activate only as a sorcery. Generic and black and sacrifice a food. You draw a card and you lose 1 life. This is the one I'm most excited about. I think it just gives you a lot of stuff to build around. You're encouraged to go food, and it gives you a very satisfying payoff. Counters that you can throw around either on Greta to win by commander damage or on a flyer or a trampler to win that way. And additionally, you can turn your food into card draw just to draw into any good threats, refill in the middle of or in the end of the game. Really, really solid. And she especially stands out when you look at the other food-related potential commanders. Experimental Confectioner is a 3-mana 2/3 human peasant. When it enters the battlefield, you create a food token, and whenever you sacrifice a food, create a 1/1 rat. I like this one a lot because it gives you a payoff for food, but I don't think it actually works as a commander, at least not yet. There's just not enough common food producers in black to take advantage of this payoff. You could maybe get by with the like 10 or so, but then you have to throw in all 10, and even then it's not that many. Intrepid Truffle Snare, on the other hand, has the opposite problem. It's a 2-mana 3/1 that whenever it attacks alone, you create a food token, which is a great, reliable way of making food. You can make a food every single turn. That's going to be excellent, and you can't do anything with that food. It's just there. You can always sacrifice it to gain life, but you always want some other use case, or at least some use of that life. In green, in common, you really don't have anything. So if you're playing Intrepid Truffle Snout, you're just kind of making the food for no reason. There's also a ton of food creators in green already. I always like to have the thing in the command zone, the thing that I'm least likely to be able to draw into, the thing that I want to make sure I always can reliably have. And in green, you can reliably find food production. Greta solves both these problems. You're in black and green, so you're not limited just to the black food production cards. And for green, she herself is the payoff. So once you have all this food, she can turn it into card draw. She can turn it into counters. Really, really solid. It's also worth pointing out Provisions Merchant. Now this one I think has a bit more potential. It's in green, so you have all the food production that green has, and then it provides an alternate payoff. Provisions Merchant is a 4-mana 3/3 beast peasant. Enters the battlefield, create a food token, and when it attacks, you may sacrifice a food. If you do, attacking creatures get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. This is a very good finisher, but also probably more of a sort of extra value mid-game piece, I'm going to assume. What's interesting about it is that you can only sacrifice 1 food a turn, so if you're producing more food than 1 a turn, you kind of can't do anything with it. It's still just sitting there. Whereas Greta can always turn into counters, always turn it into card draw, which I think is really, really nice. That said, I think Provisions Merchant has a lot of potential. you just need to find the balance between food production and creatures, because you want to go wide to take advantage of this buff. I actually think it compares decently well to the Sewer Witch that we saw earlier. The Sewer Witch you want to play as a finisher, buff your board, finish the game. Provisions Merchant doesn't really do that, because it needs to actually attack. So it needs to come down, and then wait a turn, and then attack, and maybe that finishes the game. This is why I think instead you're going to probably have it down early and trying to be spending a food every single combat for the rest of the game to continuously keep this +1/+1 and trample up to whittle down your opponents across a number of turns. And that brings us to the end of our Pauper Commanders for Wilds of Eldraine. Thank you for joining me. We saw a lot more legendaries than I was really expecting. I always like to lean towards our uncommon creatures that are not legendary because it's an opportunity you don't always have. But we're seeing that just the legendaries do feel a bit more powerful, which makes sense. If we think of legendary as a downside in Constructed, and this is what they're built for, then yeah, they're gonna be comparatively a bit stronger in a singleton format. This wasn't every uncommon creature in the set by any means, but the ones that I think have a lot of potential and the ones that are interesting to build around. Others just sort of are a cheap body, and maybe that's good enough, but it's not interesting to me. If you saw any interesting uncommons that I didn't talk about and you want to share them in the comments, I'd love to hear about them. And if you just enjoyed the video, please let me know. This is something that I've done only once other in the past. I really enjoyed it, and so I'm here doing it again, but it really, really helps to actually hear that people are watching, people are enjoying, to encourage me to keep doing them more in the future. Have a good night, everyone. I've been Darcy Bits. I'll see you next time.